The mahogany conference table stretched before me like a battlefield, its polished surface reflecting the fluorescent lights of the law office where I'd spent the last 3 decades building something extraordinary. Across from me sat Victoria Hartwell, my former business partner, her platinum blonde hair pulled back in that severe chignon she wore like armor. Her red lips curved in the same condescending smile that had haunted my nightmares for months. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. "Come now, Margaret," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Be reasonable. You're 62 years old. It's time to step aside and let someone with fresh ideas take over, someone who understands how business works in the modern world." I stared at this woman who had once been my closest friend, my confidante, the person I'd trusted with every detail of my life's work. The irony wasn't lost on me that we were sitting in the very building where I'd first hung my shingle as a fresh law school graduate 35 years ago. Broke and terrified, but determined to make something of myself. "Fresh ideas," I repeated, my voice steady despite the rage burning in my chest. "Is that what you call stealing my client base and attempting a hostile takeover of the firm I built from nothing?" Victoria's laugh was like crystal breaking. "Oh, Margaret, always so dramatic. You're getting old, darling. Your mind isn't as sharp as it used to be. The partners have noticed. The clients have noticed. Even your own secretary has expressed concerns about your episodes." Episodes. The word hit me like a physical blow. For months, Victoria had been systematically undermining me, planting seeds of doubt about my mental acuity, my judgment, my ability to handle complex cases. She'd done it so subtly, so skillfully, that I'd begun to question myself. The story of how I became Margaret Eleanor Winters, senior partner at Winters, Blackstone and Associates, didn't start in this conference room. It started 40 years ago in a trailer park outside Bakersfield, California, where I was known as Maggie Henderson, the smart kid whose mother cleaned houses and whose father disappeared when the bills got too high. I was 17 when my guidance counselor, Mrs. Patterson, called me into her office and changed my life with 8 words. "You're too smart to stay in this place." She'd been tracking my test scores, my grades, my voracious appetite for knowledge that the underfunded library couldn't satisfy. While my classmates were planning which fast food job they'd take after graduation, Mrs. Patterson was filling out scholarship applications in my name. The full ride to UCLA felt like winning the lottery. I packed everything I owned into 2 suitcases and took a Greyhound bus to Los Angeles, where I spent my first night in the dormitory crying into my pillow, terrified that someone would discover I didn't belong there. College was a culture shock that nearly broke me. My roommate, Brittany Ashford, came from old money in San Francisco. Her closet held more clothes than my mother had owned in her entire life. Brittany spoke casually about summer homes in the Hamptons and skiing in Aspen, while I worked 3 part-time jobs to afford textbooks and ramen noodles. But I had something Brittany didn't have: hunger. While she skipped classes to go shopping on Rodeo Drive, I was in the library until it closed, then studying by the light of my desk lamp until dawn. While she networked at sorority parties, I was building relationships with professors who saw something special in the girl from the wrong side of nowhere. Professor David Blackstone was the one who suggested law school. He'd been watching me demolish opposing arguments in his constitutional law class, turning complex legal theories into clear, compelling narratives that even the football players could understand. After class one day, he cornered me with an opportunity that would change everything. "Margaret," he said, using the name I'd adopted when I decided Maggie wasn't serious enough for the person I was becoming. "Have you considered law school? With your analytical mind and your ability to communicate complex ideas, you could be extraordinary." Law school at Georgetown was even more intimidating than undergrad. I was surrounded by the children of senators, judges, and corporate titans. They spoke in legal jargon like a native language, while I had to translate everything in my head first. But again, I had my secret weapon. I outworked everyone. While my classmates were at happy hour, I was crafting briefs that made professors stop mid-sentence to reread particularly elegant arguments. While they were skiing in Vail during winter break, I was interning at a small family law practice, learning how real people's lives got tangled up in legal procedures. I graduated summa cum laude and passed the bar on my first try. The offers came pouring in from white shoe firms in New York, Washington, and Los Angeles. But I had a different plan. I was going to build something of my own. I started Winters & Associates in a rented office above a Chinese restaurant in downtown Sacramento. The space smelled like sweet and sour pork, the air conditioning barely worked, and my desk was a card table from a garage sale. But it was mine. Every case I won, every client I helped, every dollar I earned was proof that the girl from the trailer park had made something of herself. The first year was brutal. I lived on coffee and determination, taking any case that walked through my door. Divorces, personal injury claims, small business disputes. Nothing was too small or too unglamorous. I developed a reputation for being thorough, aggressive, and absolutely uncompromising when it came to my clients' interests. That's how I met Victoria Hartwell. She walked into my office on a rainy Tuesday in October 1993, wearing a Chanel suit that cost more than my monthly rent. Victoria was 28, my age, but she carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd never had to wonder where her next meal was coming from. She'd been working at Morrison, Klein & Associates, one of Sacramento's most prestigious firms, but she was looking for something different. "I've heard about you," she said, settling into the folding chair across from my card table desk. "People say you're hungry, that you'll fight for your clients when the big firms won't bother." I studied her carefully. Victoria was beautiful in that polished, artificial way that money could buy. Perfect teeth, perfect skin, perfect hair. But her eyes were sharp, calculating. She reminded me of a predator sizing up potential prey. "What kind of law are you looking to practice?" I asked. "Corporate law, mergers and acquisitions. I have contacts at some major companies who are looking for representation. Clients who would pay substantial fees for the right kind of aggressive representation." The word substantial made my heart race. I was barely keeping my head above water financially, taking payment plans from clients who could barely afford my already low fees. The opportunity to work on high-stakes corporate cases was exactly what I needed to take my practice to the next level. "What's the catch?" I asked, because there was always a catch. Victoria smiled, and for the first time, it seemed genuine. "No catch. I just think we could be good for each other. You have the hunger and the talent. I have the connections and the capital. Why don't we become partners?" Looking back now, I can see all the red flags I missed. The way she deflected questions about why she was leaving her prestigious position. The vague references to her corporate contacts. The slightly too eager way she pushed for a partnership instead of simply joining my practice as an associate. But I was tired of eating ramen noodles and working 16-hour days just to stay afloat. The promise of financial security, of finally being able to compete with the big firms, was too tempting to resist. We shook hands that day, and I sealed my fate. The partnership agreement was Victoria's idea. She insisted we needed something formal, something that protected both of our interests. She brought in her own lawyer to draft the documents, a slick guy named Harrison Webb who wore $1,000 suits and spoke entirely in legal jargon. I should have brought in my own counsel to review the papers. I should have taken more time to study every clause, every provision, every seemingly innocent paragraph that would later come back to haunt me. But I was dazzled by the prospect of finally having a real partner, someone to share the burden of building something significant. The agreement was complex, full of clauses about profit sharing, decision-making authority, and procedures for adding new partners. Victoria walked me through the highlights. explaining how we'd split expenses and revenues, how we'd handle client conflicts, how we'd make major decisions about the direction of the firm. What I didn't understand then was how many loopholes she'd built into that document, how many ways she'd given herself to undermine me later. The language about mental fitness and capacity for decision-making seemed like standard boilerplate. The provisions about partner votes and majority control felt fair when we were equal partners. I signed the papers on a Friday afternoon, feeling like I was finally taking the step that would transform my struggling practice into something significant. Victoria popped a bottle of champagne she'd brought for the occasion, and we toasted our new partnership in my cramped office above the Chinese restaurant. "To the future," she said, raising her glass. "To the future," I echoed, having no idea. I was drinking to my own destruction. Victoria kept her word about bringing in corporate clients. Within 6 months, we were representing 3 major companies in complex merger negotiations. The fees were enormous, more money than I'd made in my first 3 years of practice combined. We moved to a proper office building, hired a receptionist and 2 paralegals, and started building a reputation as one of Sacramento's most aggressive corporate law practices. I threw myself into the work with the same intensity I'd brought to everything else in my life. While Victoria handled the schmoozing and relationship building, I crafted the strategies that won cases. I was the one burning the midnight oil, preparing the briefs that impressed judges and opposing counsel. I was the one finding the legal precedents that turned impossible cases into victories. Our success attracted attention. Legal journals wrote articles about our innovative approaches to corporate law. Bar associations invited us to speak at conferences. Other lawyers started referring their most challenging cases to us, knowing we had the skills and the determination to handle anything. By 1998, Winters and Hartwell had grown to 12 attorneys and a support staff of 20. We'd moved to a prestigious building in downtown Sacramento with marble floors and mahogany-paneled conference rooms that impressed even our most demanding clients. I had my own corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the Capitol building. But success brought new challenges. As the firm grew, Victoria became more interested in the business side of the practice. She took over marketing, client development, and strategic planning. She hired consultants to analyze our efficiency and productivity. She implemented new billing systems and performance metrics that turned practicing law into a numbers game. I didn't mind the changes, at first. I was happiest when I was working on cases, crafting arguments, solving complex legal puzzles. Let Victoria handle the administrative details. I would focus on what I did best. That was my first mistake. Victoria was patient. I'll give her that. She spent years positioning herself as the face of the firm while I remained buried in casework. She attended bar association events, served on professional committees, and built relationships with judges and politicians. She made sure her name appeared first in press coverage of our victories, subtly repositioning herself as the senior partner despite our equal ownership. Meanwhile, I was content to let her have the spotlight. I measured my success in cases won, clients satisfied, legal precedents established. I thought our partnership was about complementary skills and shared success. I had no idea she was playing a completely different game. The first real sign of trouble came in 2005, when Victoria suggested we bring in additional partners. The firm had grown to 18 attorneys, and she argued that we needed fresh blood, new perspectives, younger lawyers who understood how the profession was evolving. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "We're not getting any younger, Margaret," she said during one of our weekly partner meetings. "We need to start thinking about succession planning, about building a firm that can outlast us." The logic seemed sound. I was 57, Victoria was 55. We'd built something significant, but we couldn't run it forever. Bringing in younger partners would provide new energy and ensure the firm's long-term survival. Victoria had candidates in mind. 3 ambitious lawyers from major firms who were looking for partnership opportunities. All 3 were impressive. On paper, elite educations, prestigious clerkships, track records of success at major law firms. But as I reviewed their backgrounds, something bothered me. All 3 had worked at firms where Victoria had connections. All 3 specialized in areas that overlapped with my expertise, rather than expanding our capabilities. And all 3 were significantly younger than us, in their early 40s with decades of career ambition ahead of them. Why these 3? Specifically? I asked during our partner meeting. They're the best candidates available, Victoria replied smoothly. All 3 have stellar reputations and client bases that would complement our existing practice. I should have dug deeper. Should have insisted on a broader search, on candidates who would truly diversify our skills and perspectives. But I was busy with a complex antitrust case that was consuming all my attention, and I trusted Victoria's judgment on firm management issues. We made the offers. All 3 accepted. And suddenly, our 2-person partnership had become a 5-person operation. The new partners were everything Victoria had promised. Smart, aggressive, hungry for success. They brought in new clients and generated substantial revenue. They also changed the dynamic of our firm in ways I didn't immediately recognize. James Morrison, the oldest of the 3 at 42, quickly became Victoria's lieutenant. He shared her vision for expanding the firm's corporate practice and seemed to anticipate her needs in partner meetings. Patricia Williams, 39, specialized in securities law and came with contacts at several investment banks. Daniel Chen, 38, focused on international business transactions and spoke Mandarin fluently, opening doors to Asian markets. All 3 were deferential to me in public, acknowledging my role as founding partner and respecting my expertise. But in private conversations and partner meetings, I began to notice subtle shifts. Ideas I proposed were politely acknowledged but rarely implemented. Strategies I recommended were discussed to death until they died from analysis paralysis. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, I was being marginalized in the firm I had created. Victoria orchestrated it beautifully. She never directly contradicted me or challenged my authority. Instead, she used the new partners as a buffer, allowing them to raise concerns and ask questions that slowly undermined my position. When I advocated for taking on pro bono cases to maintain our connection to the community, James would raise concerns about profitability. When I suggested expanding our personal injury practice, Patricia would question whether that aligned with our corporate focus. By 2008, I felt like a stranger in my own firm. Partner meetings had become exercises in frustration, with every proposal I made subjected to endless debate and revision. Cases I'd traditionally handled were being reassigned to younger attorneys, who supposedly had more time or better client relationships. The financial crisis that year provided Victoria with the perfect excuse to consolidate power. Law firms across the country were struggling as corporate clients cut legal spending and postponed major transactions. Victoria called an emergency partner meeting to discuss how we would navigate the downturn. "We need to make some difficult decisions," she announced, standing at the head of our conference table like a general addressing troops. "The market has changed, and we need to change with it or risk losing everything we've built." She'd prepared a comprehensive presentation about market conditions, client retention strategies, and cost-cutting measures. It was impressive work, the kind of strategic thinking that had always been Victoria's strength. But buried in the middle of her recommendations was a proposal that took my breath away. "I think we need to reconsider our partnership structure," she said, clicking to a slide that showed organizational charts and profit-sharing formulas. "We have 5 equal partners trying to make decisions in a rapidly changing market. We need clearer leadership and more efficient decision-making processes." The room fell silent. I could feel the other partners watching me, waiting to see how I would respond. "What exactly are you proposing?" I asked, my voice carefully controlled. "A managing partner structure," Victoria replied. one person with ultimate authority over firm operations, strategic planning, and major decisions. We'd elect the managing partner for a 3-year term, with the possibility of renewal. I stared at her, finally understanding what I was looking at. This wasn't about efficiency or market conditions. This was a coup, planned and executed with surgical precision. "And I suppose you'd like to nominate yourself for this position?" I said. Victoria smiled, and for the first time in years, I saw the predator I'd missed when she first walked into my office. "I think the partners should vote on who would be most qualified to lead us through these challenging times." The aye vote was 4-1. Victoria, James, Patricia, and Daniel all voted for Victoria as managing partner. I was the only dissenting voice, the only person who seemed to recognize that we were fundamentally changing the nature of our partnership. "This is just temporary," Victoria assured me after the meeting. "Once the market stabilizes, we can revisit the structure." But I knew better. Power, once consolidated, is never willingly given up. Victoria had spent 13 years positioning herself for this moment, and she wasn't going to waste the opportunity. As managing partner, Victoria moved quickly to implement changes. She renegotiated our office lease, securing better terms but putting the contract in her name. She consolidated our banking relationships, streamlining our finances but giving herself sole signing authority on major accounts. She hired new staff and fired longtime employees, claiming we needed to update our skills for a changing market. Each change made sense individually. Taken together, they created a structure where Victoria controlled every aspect of our firm's operations. I remained a partner on paper, but my ability to influence decisions or challenge her authority had been systematically eliminated. The clients started following Victoria's lead. Corporate executives who had worked with me for years began directing their calls to her office instead of mine. Cases I'd developed from initial consultation through completion were transferred to other attorneys, usually with explanations about optimizing resource allocation or leveraging specialized expertise. I watched the firm I'd built slowly transform into something I no longer recognized. The aggressive, client-focused practice that had been our hallmark gave way to a more corporate culture focused on billable hours and profit margins. Young attorneys were encouraged to view clients as revenue sources rather than people with problems that needed solving. The breaking point came in early 2010 during our quarterly partner meeting. Victoria was presenting financial results, which were actually quite strong despite the recession. We'd managed to maintain most of our client base and even attract some new business from companies looking for cost-effective legal representation. "I have some additional news," Victoria said as she concluded her financial presentation. "We've received an acquisition offer from Blackstone, Meyer & Associates." The room erupted. Blackstone Meyer was one of the largest law firms on the West Coast, with offices in Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Seattle. An acquisition by them would mean substantial payouts for all partners, but it would also mean the end of Winters Hartwell as an independent practice. "They're offering each partner a significant cash payment plus guaranteed positions in their Sacramento office," Victoria continued. "For some of us, this represents an opportunity to step back from the day-to-day management challenges and focus on what we love most about practicing law." I understood the subtext immediately. This was Victoria's exit strategy, her way of cashing out while making it seem like a mutual decision. But it was also my worst nightmare. I'd spent my entire career building something of my own, creating a firm that reflected my values and my vision of what legal practice could be. The thought of becoming just another attorney in someone else's corporate structure was devastating. "What if we don't want to sell?" I asked. Victoria's smile was patronizing. "Margaret, you have to understand the realities of the current market. We're a mid-sized firm trying to compete with practices that have hundreds of attorneys and national reach. This offer represents financial security for all of us." Financial security for you, maybe. But what about our clients? What about the attorneys we've trained? What about the reputation we've built? James Morrison leaned forward. Margaret, with respect, Blackstone Meyer has an excellent reputation. Our clients would actually benefit from access to their resources and expertise. Their resources and expertise, I repeated. What about our resources and expertise? What about the knowledge and relationships we've spent years developing? Patricia Williams joined the conversation. Margaret, I think you're being overly sentimental about this. Business is business. We have a fiduciary duty to our partners to consider offers that maximize our return on investment. Return on investment. These people were talking about my life's work like it was a stock portfolio to be optimized. I need time to think about this, I said. Victoria nodded sympathetically. Of course, take all the time you need. But I should mention that Blackstone Meyer would like an answer within 30 days. Opportunities like this don't stay on the table indefinitely. 30 days to decide whether to sell the firm I'd spent my entire career building. 30 days to choose between financial security and professional independence. 30 days to determine whether Margaret Winters would end her career as a successful entrepreneur or just another cog in someone else's machine. I left that meeting knowing that the real battle was just beginning. That night, I sat in my home, office surrounded by 30 years of case files, awards, and photographs documenting my journey from Maggie Henderson to Margaret Winters. I thought about Mrs. Patterson, who'd believed in a trailer park kid when no one else would. I thought about Professor Blackstone, who'd seen potential in a student others dismissed as too hungry, too aggressive, too unconventional. I thought about the first client I'd ever helped, a young mother whose ex-husband was hiding assets to avoid paying child support. I'd worked for weeks tracking down his financial records, finally uncovering accounts he'd established under his mother's name. The relief on her face when I handed her a settlement check that would support her children for years had been worth more than any partnership bonus. I thought about the corporate executives who'd trusted me with billion-dollar mergers, the small business owners who'd relied on my guidance to navigate complex regulations, the families who'd turned to me when everything they'd worked for was at risk. All of it was about to disappear, absorbed into some corporate law factory where attorneys were interchangeable parts and client relationships were just entries in a database, unless I fought back. I opened my laptop and began researching Blackstone, Meyer and Associates. I studied their financial statements, their client lists, their recent acquisitions. I researched their partners, their business model, their reputation in the legal community. What I found was troubling. Blackstone Meyer had a pattern of acquiring successful smaller firms, stripping out their most profitable clients and practices, then downsizing staff and eliminating redundancies. Partners from acquired firms rarely lasted more than 2 years, before being squeezed out or leaving in frustration. This wasn't an acquisition. It was a liquidation dressed up as an opportunity. I spent the next week reviewing every document related to our partnership agreement, looking for any provision that might give me leverage in blocking the sale. What I found made my blood run cold. The acquisition required approval from a majority of partners, but Victoria had been clever about the timing. The 3 partners she'd brought in were all financially motivated and had limited emotional attachment to the firm. James was facing expensive private school tuition for 3 children. Patricia was going through a costly divorce. Daniel was supporting elderly parents and had significant student loan debt. For them, the Blackstone Meyer offer represented life-changing money with minimal risk. They had every reason to vote yes, and no compelling reason to vote no. Victoria had stacked the deck perfectly. 4 votes for the acquisition, 1 against. Democracy in action. But as I studied the partnership agreement more carefully, I noticed something interesting. The document was full of Victorian self-serving provisions, but it also contained some language that might work in my favor. There were requirements for due diligence, financial disclosure, and partner notification that hadn't been fully satisfied. More importantly, there were provisions about the fiduciary duties partners owed to each other and to the firm. Victoria's secret negotiations with Blackstone Meyer, conducted without full partner input, might constitute a breach of those duties. I had the foundation for a legal challenge, but did I have the stomach for a fight that would inevitably destroy what remained of our professional relationship and probably guarantee the firm's dissolution? As I sat in my office that night, surrounded by the detritus of my career, I heard Victoria's voice echoing in my memory. "Be reasonable, Margaret. You're 62 years old. It's time to step aside and let someone with fresh ideas take over." Fresh ideas, code for younger, more compliant, more willing to prioritize profit over principle. I thought about every challenge I'd overcome in my life. The poverty, the prejudice, the assumption that a girl from a trailer park couldn't compete with the children of privilege. Every time someone had underestimated me, I'd proven them wrong through hard work, intelligence, and sheer determination. Victoria was making the same mistake all the others had made. She was confusing age with weakness, experience with obsolescence, wisdom with irrelevance. She was about to learn how wrong she was. I reached for my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in years. Professor David Blackstone, now retired but still sharp as ever, answered on the second ring. "Margaret, what a pleasant surprise. How are you, my dear?" "I'm in trouble, Professor, and I need advice from someone I trust." "Tell me everything," he said, and I could hear the intensity in his voice that had made him such a formidable advocate and teacher. I told him about Victoria, about the partnership agreement, about the acquisition offer and the stacked vote. I told him about feeling marginalized in my own firm, about watching my life's work being systematically dismantled by someone I'd trusted. Professor Blackstone listened without interruption, occasionally asking clarifying questions about legal details or timeline issues. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Margaret," he finally said, "do you remember what I told you about legal practice when you were considering law school? You said the law was a weapon that could be used for good or evil, depending on who wielded it." "That's right. And you've spent your career wielding it for good, helping clients, building something meaningful. But sometimes, the law needs to be used to protect itself from those who would corrupt it." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that Victoria has forgotten something important about legal practice. Intelligence and experience matter more than youth and connections. And you, my dear, are about to remind her why she should never have underestimated you." The next morning, I walked into the office with a plan. The manila envelope arrived at my home address on a Thursday evening, hand-delivered by a courier who waited while I signed for it. Inside was a formal notice from Victoria's attorney, Harrison Webb, informing me that an emergency partner meeting had been scheduled for the following Monday to vote on the Blackstone Meyer acquisition. The timing was deliberate. Thursday delivery meant I had exactly 4 days to prepare, including a weekend when most legal resources would be unavailable. Victoria was applying pressure, trying to force a quick decision before I could mount any meaningful opposition. She had underestimated me again. I spent Friday morning in the law library at UC Davis, researching partnership law and fiduciary duty cases. The librarian, a woman named Susan who remembered me from my guest lectures, unlocked special collections and provided access to databases that weren't available to the general public. By noon, I had compiled a stack of precedents that would make Victoria very uncomfortable. The California Partnership Act was clear about the duties partners owed each other. Victoria's secret negotiations with Blackstone Meyer, conducted without full disclosure to all partners, constituted a potential breach of her fiduciary obligations. More importantly, her systematic efforts to marginalize me over the past several years could be construed as self-dealing, designed to enhance her own position at the expense of the partnership. But legal precedents were only part of the battle. I needed evidence, documentation that would prove Victoria's pattern of undermining behavior, and I knew exactly where to find it. Friday afternoon, I drove to our office building and used my key card to access the 23rd floor. The receptionist had left for the day, and most of the attorneys were either in court or heading home early for the weekend. The executive suite where Victoria maintained her managing partner office was empty. I'd helped design the security system when we moved to this building. Each partner had access to common areas and their own offices, but Victoria's recent renovations had included additional security measures for her private workspace. What she didn't know was that I still had override codes from the original installation. Victoria's office was a monument to her ambitions. The mahogany desk had belonged to a 19th century railroad baron. The oil paintings on the walls were originals, purchased with firm funds but displayed like personal trophies. The Persian rug had cost more than most people earned in 6 months. Her computer was password protected, but Victoria had always been careless about digital security. I'd watched her enter her password dozens of times during partner meetings, and like most people, she used variations of the same basic combination. After 3 attempts, I was in. The email folders were a revelation. Victoria had been planning this acquisition for over 2 years, conducting preliminary negotiations with Blackstone Meyer, while publicly maintaining that she was committed to our independence. She'd shared confidential firm financial data, client lists, and strategic plans without authorization from the other partners. More damaging were the internal communications with James, Patricia, and Daniel. Victoria had been systematically influencing their perspectives on firm management, subtly undermining my authority while positioning herself as the visionary leader we needed for the future. The emails revealed a coordinated campaign to marginalize me that went back to the day the new partners joined the firm. One exchange from 6 months earlier was particularly revealing. Victoria had written to James about a client presentation I'd given that had resulted in a major new retainer. Margaret's old-school approach worked this time, but we need to be careful about letting her take the lead on high-profile matters. Clients expect sophisticated, forward-thinking counsel, not someone who still thinks like it's 1985. We should start transitioning her to more of an emeritus role. James had responded enthusiastically. Agreed. I've noticed some concerning signs during partner meetings. Her questions about the new billing software seemed confused, and she doesn't seem to grasp how social media marketing could help us attract younger clients. My hands were shaking as I read these exchanges. Every hesitation, every question, every moment of uncertainty had been cataloged and weaponized against me. Victoria had been building a case for my incompetence that existed only in her carefully crafted narrative. I printed everything: emails, financial projections, negotiation summaries, character assassinations disguised as partnership discussions. By the time I finished, I had 3 inches of documentation that painted a clear picture of Victoria's betrayal. But I wasn't done yet. Saturday morning, I called Patricia Williams' ex-husband, Richard. Their divorce had been acrimonious, and Patricia had made the mistake of confiding firm business during their settlement negotiations. Richard was a commercial real estate developer who'd lost significant money when Patricia's legal fees depleted their joint accounts. "Margaret, I was wondering when you'd figure out what Patricia was really up to," he said when I explained why I was calling. "What do you mean?" "She's been planning her exit strategy for over a year. Did you know she's already accepted a position with Blackstone Meyer? The acquisition is just a formality. She's been feeding them information about your client base and internal operations for months." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Patricia wasn't just voting for the acquisition, she was actively orchestrating it from the inside. "How do you know this?" "Discovery documents from our divorce. Her employment contract with Blackstone Meyer was listed as a marital asset. She's getting a substantial signing bonus plus a guaranteed partnership track. The timing is tied to when they complete the acquisition of your firm." Richard emailed me copies of the relevant documents within an hour. Patricia's secret employment agreement included provisions for client transition services and detailed knowledge transfer about Winters and Hartwell's operations. She'd been working as a double agent, using her position as a partner to facilitate our destruction. Sunday, I met with Professor Blackstone at his home in Davis. His study was lined with law books and legal journals, a scholar's sanctuary that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with the law in the first place. "This is worse than I thought," he said after reviewing the evidence I'd compiled. "Victoria hasn't just breached her fiduciary duties, she's engaged in systematic fraud. And Patricia's actions could constitute corporate espionage." "What are my options?" Professor Blackstone leaned back in his leather chair, his eyes bright with the kind of intellectual excitement I remembered from his classroom lectures. "You have several paths forward. You could file for dissolution of the partnership based on breach of fiduciary duty. You could seek injunctive relief to block the acquisition pending a full investigation. Or you could play a more subtle game." "What kind of subtle game?" "Victoria expects you to be emotional, reactive, defeated. She's counting on you to either accept the acquisition quietly or make a scene that can be dismissed as the ranting of a bitter old woman. What she's not expecting is for you to outmaneuver her strategically." I listened as Professor Blackstone outlined a plan that would use Victoria's own tactics against her. Instead of opposing the acquisition directly, I would expose the fraud and breach of fiduciary duty in a way that would destroy the deal and discredit Victoria simultaneously. "The key is timing and presentation," he explained. "You need to reveal your evidence at the moment when it will have maximum impact, in front of witnesses who can't be intimidated or bought off." Monday morning arrived gray and rainy, the kind of weather that matched my mood as I prepared for what would likely be my final partner meeting at Winters and Hartwell. I dressed carefully, choosing a navy blue suit that projected authority and competence. I packed my briefcase with the evidence I'd compiled, organizing it for maximum dramatic effect. The partner meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock in our main conference room. When I arrived, Victoria was already there, reviewing notes with James, Patricia, and Daniel. They looked up when I entered, their expressions a mixture of sympathy and condescension. "Margaret," Victoria said, rising to embrace me in a gesture that felt more like a performance than genuine affection. "I'm so glad you're here. I know this is difficult, but I think you'll see that this acquisition really is the best thing for everyone." I took my seat at the conference table, the same spot I'd occupied for countless meetings over the past 17 years. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was about to destroy my own partnership in the same room where we'd celebrated our greatest victories. Victoria began with a presentation about market conditions and competitive pressures. She talked about the changing legal landscape, the advantages of scale, the security that would come from being part of a larger organization. It was polished, professional, and completely misleading. "I know some of us have emotional attachments to our independence," she said, glancing in my direction. "But we have to think rationally about what's best for our clients, our staff, and ourselves." James nodded enthusiastically. "Victoria's right. This offer represents financial security for all of us. We'd be crazy to turn it down." Patricia chimed in with statistics about law firm consolidation and the benefits of joining a national practice. Daniel discussed the international opportunities that would be available through Blackstone Myers' global network. Throughout their presentations, I remained silent, taking notes and watching their body language. Victoria kept checking her watch, clearly eager to move to the vote before I could mount any meaningful opposition. "Are there any questions before we proceed to the formal vote?" Victoria asked. I raised my hand. "I have a few questions about the due diligence process." Victoria's smile became strained. "Of course, Margaret. What would you like to know?" "When did negotiations with Blackstone Meyer begin?" "About 6 weeks ago, when they first approached us with an informal inquiry." I opened my briefcase and pulled out the first set of emails. "That's interesting, because according to these communications, you've been in active negotiations for over 2 years. The room fell silent. Victoria's face went pale as she recognized her own words being read back to her. "Margaret, I don't know where you got those documents, but you're taking them out of context." "Am I? Let me read this email from 14 months ago where you provided Blackstone Meyer with confidential financial projections and client lists. Was that also out of context?" James leaned forward. "Margaret, how did you obtain Victoria's private emails?" "They're not private, James. They're partnership business conducted using firm resources. And speaking of partnership business, I have some interesting information about Patricia's employment prospects." Patricia's face went white. "What are you talking about?" I pulled out her secret employment contract with Blackstone Meyer. "I'm talking about your agreement to provide client transition services and detailed operational intelligence in exchange for a guaranteed partnership position. When exactly were you planning to disclose this conflict of interest to your current partners?" The room erupted. Daniel demanded to know how long Patricia had been planning to leave. James accused Victoria of conducting secret negotiations without proper authorization. Patricia tried to claim that her employment discussions were preliminary and non-binding. But I wasn't finished. "There's more," I said, raising my voice to cut through the chaos. "I've spent the weekend reviewing 3 years of internal communications, financial records, and client development activities. What I've discovered is a systematic pattern of self-dealing, breach of fiduciary duty, and potential fraud." I began methodically presenting evidence of Victoria's manipulation campaign. The emails where she questioned my competence, the financial arrangements that had gradually shifted control to her office, the client relationships that had been systematically transferred away from me without justification. "This isn't just about the acquisition," I continued. "This is about a carefully orchestrated plan to marginalize me as a partner, undermine my authority, and ultimately force me out of the firm I created." Victoria tried to regain control. "Margaret, you're clearly upset about the changes we've had to make, but this is business. Personal feelings can't interfere with our fiduciary responsibilities to the partnership." "You're absolutely right, Victoria. Personal feelings can't interfere with fiduciary responsibilities, which is why I've prepared a formal complaint alleging breach of fiduciary duty, self-dealing, and fraud in connection with the proposed acquisition." I pulled out the legal documents I'd prepared over the weekend: a petition for judicial dissolution of the partnership, requests for injunctive relief, to block the acquisition, demands for a full forensic accounting of partnership assets and client relationships. I'm also filing a complaint with the state bar, alleging violations of professional conduct rules, including failure to disclose conflicts of interest and misappropriation of client relationships. The room was absolutely silent now. Victoria stared at the legal documents like they were written in a foreign language. "You can't be serious," she finally said. "I'm completely serious. You wanted to treat this partnership like a business transaction? Fine. Let's see how your acquisition plans hold up under judicial scrutiny." James found his voice first. "Margaret, this is nuclear. If you file these complaints, it won't just stop the acquisition. It could destroy the entire firm." "The firm is already destroyed, James. Victoria killed it the day she decided to betray her partners for personal gain. I'm just making sure everyone understands what really happened here." Patricia was frantically texting, probably trying to reach her contacts at Blackstone Meyer. Daniel was reviewing the employment contract I'd exposed, his expression growing more concerned as he realized the legal implications. Victoria stood up, her composed mask finally slipping to reveal the rage underneath. "You vindictive old bitch! You'd rather destroy everything than admit you're not relevant anymore." "There it is," I said calmly. "The real Victoria Hartwell. Not the polished professional, but the snake who's been plotting against me for years." I stood up and gathered my documents. "The formal vote on the acquisition is postponed pending resolution of the legal issues I've raised. All partners will..." Receive copies of the complaints I'm filing, along with the supporting evidence. As I walked toward the door, Victoria made one last desperate attempt to maintain control. "You're making a huge mistake, Margaret. You'll never work in this town again. I'll make sure of it." I turned back to face her, and for the first time in months, I felt completely calm. "Victoria, you've spent so much time underestimating me that you've forgotten something important. I don't need to work in this town. I own it." I walked out of that conference room knowing that the war had officially begun. The next few days moved with the inexorable pace of a legal avalanche. I filed my complaints with the Superior Court on Tuesday morning, accompanied by 3 boxes of supporting documentation. The local legal community was buzzing with rumors by lunchtime. Victoria tried to control the narrative, claiming that I was having some sort of breakdown and that my allegations were the desperate actions of a partner who couldn't accept the changing nature of modern legal practice. But the evidence spoke for itself, and several prominent attorneys who'd watched our firm's growth over the years began asking uncomfortable questions about Victoria's version of events. Blackstone Myers attorneys requested an emergency meeting on Wednesday. They'd received copies of my court filings and were deeply concerned about the legal and reputational risks of proceeding with an acquisition that was now the subject of fraud allegations. Harrison Webb, Victoria's lawyer, tried to negotiate a settlement that would allow the acquisition to proceed. He offered me a substantial cash payment in exchange for withdrawing my complaints and agreeing to a non-disclosure agreement about the partnership disputes. I declined. Thursday brought the first newspaper coverage of the legal battle. The Sacramento Business Journal ran a front-page story about the partnership dispute at one of the city's most prominent law firms. The article quoted legal ethics experts who described the allegations as serious and potentially career-ending for the attorneys involved. Victoria called me that evening, her voice shaking with barely controlled fury. "You've destroyed everything we built together," she said. 20 years of partnership, and you're willing to burn it all down because your feelings got hurt." "My feelings didn't get hurt, Victoria. My trust got betrayed. There's a difference. We could have worked this out privately. We could have found a solution that protected everyone's interests. We could have, if you'd approached me honestly instead of conducting secret negotiations and character assassination campaigns. But you chose to treat me like an obstacle to be removed rather than a partner to be respected." The call ended with Victoria threatening to counter-sue for defamation and interference with business relationships. I welcomed the threat. Discovery in a defamation case would give me access to even more evidence of her misconduct. Friday afternoon, I received a call from Professor Blackstone with news that changed everything. "Margaret, I've been making some inquiries about Blackstone Myers' recent acquisition activities. You need to know that they're currently under investigation by the State Bar in Oregon for their treatment of partners from firms they've acquired." "What kind of treatment?" "Systematic marginalization, forced resignations, breach of employment, agreements. The pattern is identical to what Victoria was trying to do to you. Blackstone Myers specializes in acquiring successful smaller firms, stripping out their valuable assets, and discarding the founding partners." The revelation reframed everything. Victoria hadn't just betrayed me. She'd been preparing to become their next victim. Her sophisticated understanding of business strategy hadn't protected her from being manipulated by lawyers who were even more ruthless than she was. I spent the weekend preparing for what would be the most important week of my legal career. The court had scheduled an emergency hearing on my request for injunctive relief, and both sides would have the opportunity to present their arguments about whether the acquisition should be blocked pending resolution of the partnership dispute. But I had one more surprise in store for Victoria, something that would demonstrate just how thoroughly she had underestimated my strategic thinking. Sunday evening, I called a meeting with our firm's most important clients. Not through official channels, but through personal relationships I'd built over decades of legal representation. I explained the situation honestly, providing them with copies of the evidence I'd compiled and letting them draw their own conclusions about what had been happening to their law firm. The response was immediate and decisive. 3 major corporate clients announced that they would be terminating their relationships with Winters and Hartwell effective immediately, citing concerns about the stability and ethical standards of the firm's management. 2 others demanded meetings with the state bar to discuss their options for recovering fees paid to attorneys who might have been operating under conflicts of interest. By Monday morning, Victoria's carefully constructed acquisition deal was collapsing from multiple directions. Blackstone Meyer was facing uncomfortable questions about their due diligence practices. The firm's client base was evaporating, and the legal community was watching to see how the ethics complaints would be resolved. But Victoria had one final card to play, and she was about to reveal just how desperate she'd become. The emergency hearing was scheduled for Tuesday morning in Judge Patricia Morrison's courtroom. Judge Morrison was known for her no-nonsense approach to complex litigation and her intolerance for attorney misconduct. She'd reviewed all the pleadings over the weekend and had specific questions about the timeline of events and the evidence supporting my allegations. Victoria appeared with a team of 3 attorneys from San Francisco, high-powered litigators who specialized in partnership disputes and business torts. They'd prepared a comprehensive response that attempted to reframe my complaints as the actions of a disgruntled partner who couldn't accept the evolving nature of modern legal practice. Their strategy was to attack my mental competence, suggesting that my recent behavior indicated cognitive decline and possible dementia. They'd obtained affidavits from staff members who claimed I'd been confused during meetings, struggled with new technology, and made inappropriate comments about firm management. It was a desperate tactic, but potentially effective if they could establish a pattern of concerning behavior that would undermine my credibility as a witness. Victoria took the stand first, presenting herself as a concerned partner who'd been trying to protect both the firm and me from the consequences of my declining abilities. She testified about my alleged confusion during partner meetings, my resistance to technological improvements, and my increasingly paranoid suspicions about normal business operations. I've been trying to help Margaret transition to a reduced role that would allow her to maintain her dignity while ensuring that our clients receive the quality of representation they deserve, she said, her voice full of practiced concern. Her attorneys presented their character witnesses, current and former staff members who'd been coached to describe incidents that could be interpreted as evidence of cognitive decline. A paralegal testified that I'd become forgetful about deadlines. A secretary claimed I'd been confused about the new phone system. An associate suggested that my recent legal research had been substandard. It was a carefully orchestrated performance designed to paint me as a pitiable figure whose accusations were the product of age-related mental deterioration. When my turn came to respond, I stood up slowly, allowing the courtroom to absorb the image of a supposedly declining elderly woman. Then I began to speak, and my voice was crystal clear and completely steady. Your Honor, opposing counsel has presented a fascinating theory about my mental competence. They suggest that my ability to uncover 2 years of secret negotiations, compile comprehensive evidence of fiduciary breaches, identify conflicts of interest, and prepare legally sophisticated complaints indicates cognitive decline. I paused, allowing the contradiction to sink in. If this is what mental deterioration looks like, I can only wonder what they think mental acuity would accomplish. I methodically destroyed each piece of their character evidence, demonstrating how Victoria's witnesses had been misled about context or coached to misinterpret normal business interactions. The paralegal who claimed I was forgetful about deadlines had confused me with another attorney. The secretary who said I was confused about the phone system had never actually worked with me directly. The associate who questioned my research abilities had been given work product that wasn't mine, but my real response was yet to come. Your Honor, I'd like to present some additional evidence that opposing counsel may not have anticipated. I called Professor Blackstone as my first witness. He testified about my academic achievements, my career trajectory, and his recent interactions with me during the preparation of this case. Margaret Winters is one of the sharpest legal minds I've encountered in 40 years of teaching and practice, he said. Her analysis of the partnership issues is sophisticated, thorough, and completely coherent. If she's suffering from cognitive decline, it's the most intellectually productive decline in medical history. My second witness was Dr. Sarah Chen, a neuropsychologist who'd conducted comprehensive cognitive testing at my request. Her evaluation included memory assessments, executive function tests, and detailed analysis of my ability to process complex information. Mrs. Winters' cognitive function is not only normal for her age group, it's superior to most people 20 years younger, Dr. Chen testified. Her working memory, analytical reasoning, and decision-making capabilities are all in the 95th percentile or higher. But my most powerful witness was someone Victoria hadn't expected. Rebecca Martinez, the court reporter who'd been documenting partner meetings for the past 3 years. Rebecca testified that she'd reviewed her transcripts of all recent partner meetings at my request. The transcripts revealed that my questions and comments had been consistently substantive and well-informed. More importantly, they showed that Victoria had been systematically cutting off my comments and redirecting discussions whenever I raised concerns about firm management. Mrs. Winters wasn't confused during these meetings, Rebecca testified. She was being silenced. As the hearing progressed, Victoria's composure began to crack. The weight of evidence was overwhelming, and her attorney's strategy of attacking my competence was backfiring spectacularly. Judge Morrison called a brief recess, and I could see Victoria huddled with her legal team, their voices urgent and their expressions grim. When court resumed, Victoria's lead attorney made a surprising announcement. Your Honor, in the interest of resolving this matter efficiently, our clients are prepared to discuss settlement terms that would address Mrs. Winters' concerns while allowing the business transaction to proceed. Judge Morrison looked skeptical. Counselor, we're in the middle of an evidentiary hearing about serious allegations of fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. Are you suggesting that these issues can be resolved through private negotiation? We believe that the underlying dispute is fundamentally a business disagreement that has been complicated by personal animosity between the partners. I stood up. Your Honor, respectfully, this is not a personal disagreement. The evidence clearly shows systematic fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and violations of professional conduct rules. These are not issues that can be resolved through private settlement. Judge Morrison nodded. I agree with Mrs. Winters. The court has an obligation to ensure that the legal profession maintains appropriate ethical standards. We'll proceed with the hearing. The next phase of testimony focused on the financial evidence I'd compiled. A forensic accountant I'd hired walked through Victoria's pattern of self-dealing, showing how she'd gradually shifted control of firm assets to her personal benefit. The analysis revealed that Victoria had been systematically overcharging the partnership for office expenses, consulting fees, and administrative costs. More damaging was the testimony about client development and retention. My expert witness demonstrated that clients who'd been transferred away from me had consistently generated higher fees when I was handling their matters. Victoria's claim that the transfers were based on efficiency and expertise was contradicted by the financial data. By the end of the day, Victoria's position was untenable. The evidence of her misconduct was overwhelming, and her attempts to discredit me had only highlighted the sophistication of my legal strategy. But she had one final desperate move to make, and it would reveal the true extent of her character. That evening, Victoria called me at home. Her voice was different now, stripped of the professional polish and fake concern. She sounded like what she'd always been, a predator who'd been cornered and was looking for any way to escape. You win, Margaret. You've destroyed the acquisition, ruined my reputation, and probably ended my career. I hope you're satisfied. I'm not interested in destroying you, Victoria. I just want to protect what I built. Protect it? You've killed it. The firm is finished. The clients are gone. The other partners will never trust each other again. You've burned down everything we worked for. We didn't work for it together. I worked for it while you planned to steal it." There was a long pause. When Victoria spoke again, her voice was cold and calculating. "You think you've won, but you haven't thought this through. Yes, the acquisition is dead. But what exactly have you saved? A law firm with no clients, no trust between partners, and a reputation for internal warfare. You've preserved the right to captain a sinking ship." She was right, and we both knew it. My legal victory had come at the cost of destroying the firm itself. The question was whether I could salvage anything from the wreckage, or whether Victoria's final act of spite would be to ensure that my Pyrrhic victory left me with nothing, but the satisfaction of having exposed her betrayal. "There's one more thing, Margaret," Victoria continued. "Something you might want to consider before you celebrate too much. I've been documenting our conversations over the past few months, including some very interesting statements you made about your plans for revenge." My blood ran cold. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about your admission that you illegally accessed my computer and email accounts. I'm talking about your descriptions of the evidence you compiled through what could be considered corporate espionage. I'm talking about statements that could be interpreted as extortion threats against the other partners." I felt the ground shifting beneath me. In my determination to gather evidence of Victoria's misconduct, had I crossed legal lines that would make me vulnerable to criminal charges? "You're bluffing," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. "Am I? We'll find out tomorrow, won't we? I've retained criminal defense counsel, and they're very interested in the methods you use to obtain your evidence. Turns out that accessing someone's computer without authorization is a felony, regardless of what you discover." The line went dead, and I sat in my kitchen staring at the phone, finally understanding the full scope of Victoria's strategy. She hadn't just been planning to steal my firm. She'd been setting a trap that would destroy me personally and professionally, even if her acquisition plans failed, and I had walked directly into it. That night, I didn't sleep. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad, mapping out every conversation I'd had with Victoria over the past month, every action I'd taken, every piece of evidence I'd gathered. If she was planning to accuse me of criminal activity, I needed to understand exactly what I was facing. The computer access was problematic. I'd used override codes that were technically still valid, but accessing another partner's private communications without explicit permission was legally questionable at best. Victoria's attorneys would argue that I'd committed unauthorized computer access, potentially a felony under California law. But as I reviewed the timeline and the evidence, I realized something Victoria hadn't considered. Her own actions had created legal vulnerabilities that made her threats essentially meaningless. At 6 a.m, I called Professor Blackstone. "Margaret, are you all right? It's quite early. I need to ask you about criminal law, specifically about unauthorized computer access and the necessity defense." "Ah, Victoria's threatening criminal charges for how you obtained your evidence?" "Exactly. Can she make it stick?" Professor Blackstone was quiet for a moment, and I could almost hear him thinking through the legal issues. "It depends on several factors. The computer access could be problematic, but there are potential defenses. If you can demonstrate that you had reasonable belief that serious crimes were being committed and that accessing the information was necessary to prevent ongoing harm, you might have a viable necessity defense." "What about the fact that I'm a partner in the firm? Don't I have some inherent right to access partnership information?" "That's actually a stronger argument. Partnership law generally gives partners broad rights to examine partnership records and communications. Victoria would have to prove that her personal emails were separate from partnership business, which could be difficult given that she was conducting acquisition negotiations on behalf of the firm." I felt some of the tension leave my shoulders. Victoria's threat wasn't as powerful as she'd hoped. There's something else you should consider, Professor Blackstone continued. If Victoria files criminal charges based on your investigation, she'll have to explain why she was so desperate to prevent you from discovering the information. That could open up the entire fraud case to criminal prosecution. You mean she'd be risking criminal charges herself? Absolutely. Wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy, breach of fiduciary duty in commercial context. The federal prosecutors take white-collar crime very seriously, especially when it involves systematic deception and financial harm. By the time I hung up, I had the foundation of a strategy that would turn Victoria's final threat into her ultimate downfall. Wednesday morning, I walked into the courthouse with a new filing, a formal request to refer the matter to the U.S. Attorney's Office for investigation of potential federal crimes. The document outlined Victoria's pattern of fraud, the interstate nature of her communications with Blackstone Meyer, and the use of mail and wire communications to further the conspiracy. Victoria's attorneys were waiting in the hallway outside the courtroom, clearly expecting me to be panicked about the criminal charges she'd threatened. Instead, I handed them a copy of my federal referral request. I thought you might want to review this before we proceed with today's hearing, I said calmly. The lead attorney's face went pale as he scanned the document. Victoria had clearly not told her legal team about the extent of her communications with Blackstone Meyer, or about Patricia's secret employment agreement. Mrs. Winters, perhaps we should discuss a global resolution of all these issues, said quietly. I'm afraid that's no longer possible. Once I file this referral, the matter will be out of my hands. Judge Morrison called the hearing to order before Victoria's team could respond. The scheduled topic was my motion for injunctive relief, but the criminal referral had changed the dynamics entirely. Your Honor, I began. Since our last hearing, additional evidence has come to light that suggests this matter involves potential federal crimes. I've prepared a referral to the U.S. Attorney's Office that I believe should be filed immediately. Victoria's lead attorney jumped up. Your Honor, this is clearly a desperate attempt to avoid accountability for Mrs. Winters' own illegal conduct in obtaining evidence through unauthorized computer access. I see, Judge Morrison said. And what illegal conduct are you alleging? The attorney realized too late that he'd walked into a trap. To prove that I'd acted illegally, he'd have to admit that Victoria had been conducting secret negotiations and hiding evidence of fraud from her partners. Well, Your Honor, Mrs. Winters admittedly accessed confidential communications without authorization. Confidential communications about what? I asked innocently. About business matters that is, about secret negotiations to sell the firm without proper partner approval, about providing confidential client information to potential acquirers, about systematic efforts to defraud the partnership. Judge Morrison's expression was grim. Counselor, are you seriously suggesting that Mrs. Winters should be prosecuted for discovering evidence of her partner's criminal activity? Your Honor, we're not conceding that any criminal activity occurred. Then what exactly are you alleging? Mrs. Winters discovered through this supposedly illegal computer access? The attorney was trapped. He couldn't argue that I'd committed a crime without admitting that Victoria had been hiding evidence of her own crimes. Your Honor, I interjected, I'd like to clarify something about the computer access issue. As a partner in the firm, I had legitimate access to partnership communications and records. The information I obtained was all related to firm business conducted using partnership resources. I pulled out another document I'd prepared. I've also obtained an expert opinion on the partnership agreement and my rights as a founding partner. According to this analysis, I had not only the right, but the obligation to investigate potential breaches of fiduciary duty. Judge Morrison reviewed the expert opinion, nodding as she read. It seems to me that Mrs. Winters was acting within her rights as a partner to investigate concerns about firm management. The question is whether the evidence she discovered justifies the extraordinary relief she's seeking. Victoria's attorney made one last, desperate argument. Your Honor, even if some business disagreements occurred, Mrs. Winters's response has been completely disproportionate. She's destroyed a valuable business opportunity and damaged the reputations of respected attorneys based on her misinterpretation of normal business communications. I stood up slowly, and the courtroom fell silent. Your Honor, I'd like to share something with the court. Last night, Ms. Hartwell called me and threatened to file false criminal charges unless I withdrew my complaints. She attempted to extort my silence by claiming she had recorded our conversations and would mischaracterize them to law enforcement. I played a recording of Victoria's threat, her voice clearly audible as she described her plan to destroy me through fabricated criminal charges. The courtroom erupted. Victoria's face went white as she realized I'd recorded her extortion attempt. Her attorneys huddled frantically, whispering urgent warnings about the implications of what they'd just heard. Judge Morrison banged her gavel for order. Ms. Hartwell, did you threaten Mrs.? She filed her complaint 2 weeks later. The investigation revealed that her male partners had been systematically excluding her from profitable cases while saddling her with administrative work that didn't generate billable hours. The settlement allowed her to start her own practice with sufficient capital to compete effectively. These successes reminded me daily that Victoria's betrayal had led to something unexpected, a new career that was more meaningful than anything I'd done before. 2 years after the criminal trial, I received an invitation to speak at the American Bar Association's annual conference about partnership ethics and fiduciary duties. The audience included hundreds of attorneys from across the country, many of them senior partners facing their own challenges with firm management and succession planning. During the question and answer session, a woman in her 50s raised her hand. Mrs. Winters, how do you know when professional disagreements have crossed the line into ethical violations? Trust is not binary, I replied. It's not something that's either completely present or completely absent. Trust erodes gradually through small betrayals and minor deceptions. The key is recognizing the pattern before it becomes irreversible. Another attorney asked about the emotional toll of fighting former partners in court. The hardest part wasn't the legal battle, I said. It was accepting that someone I'd trusted completely had been planning my professional destruction for years. But here's what I learned. The person who betrays your trust is revealing their character, not yours. Your obligation is to protect yourself and others who might be similarly victimized. After my presentation, several attorneys approached me with their own stories of partnership betrayals and ethical violations. One theme emerged repeatedly: the assumption that older, more experienced attorneys were less capable of aggressive, legal tactics. They think we're too old to fight, one woman told me, too set in our ways to adapt to new strategies. That assumption, I replied, is their greatest vulnerability. While they're underestimating your capabilities, you're demonstrating exactly how dangerous it is to confuse wisdom with weakness. The final question of the day came from a young male attorney who couldn't have been more than 30. Mrs. Winters, do you think your approach would work for someone my age facing similar challenges? I smiled at the question. The principles are universal. Document meticulously. Investigate thoroughly. Never let anyone convince you that fighting for your professional survival is somehow unprofessional. Age and experience are advantages, but they're not requirements for standing up to unethical colleagues. As I flew home from the conference, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed since that confrontation with Victoria. I'd discovered that my true calling wasn't building a traditional law firm, but helping other attorneys navigate the ethical and professional challenges that could destroy careers and lives. The Winters Legal Advocacy Center had grown to include 8 attorneys and a support staff of 12. We'd handled over 200 cases involving partnership disputes, ethical violations, and professional misconduct. Our success rate was over 90%, and our client satisfaction scores were the highest in the region. But the most meaningful measure of success was the feedback from clients who'd found the courage to fight back against impossible odds. Maria Santos, the solo practitioner whose case had been our first success, sent me a card every year on the anniversary of her victory. "You didn't just save my practice," she wrote in the latest card. "You taught me that being right is worth fighting for, even when fighting is frightening." Professor Blackstone, now in his 80s but still sharp as ever, had become my closest advisor and dearest friend. He often reminded me that the best victories weren't just legal successes, but transformations that created lasting positive change. "You've built something remarkable here, Margaret," he told me during one of our weekly strategy meetings. "Not just a successful practice, but a model for how the legal profession should operate." On my 65th birthday, my staff surprised me with a bound collection of thank you letters from clients we'd helped over the past 3 years. Reading through them that evening, I was struck by how many used similar language to describe their situations. Impossible odds, overwhelming opposition, no hope of winning. Yet somehow, we'd found ways to help them win anyway. The secret, I'd learned, wasn't superior resources or better connections. It was the simple recognition that unethical attorneys, no matter how sophisticated their schemes, always have vulnerabilities that can be exploited by someone willing to work harder and think more strategically. Victoria had made the classic mistake of believing her own propaganda. She'd convinced herself that I was too old, too set in my ways, too emotionally attached to the past to mount an effective counterattack. Her overconfidence had been her downfall. But more importantly, her betrayal had revealed something about myself that I might never have discovered otherwise. I wasn't just a competent attorney who could handle complex legal problems. I was someone who could take on the most powerful opponents and find ways to win through preparation, persistence, and strategic thinking. The phone rang, interrupting my reflections. It was another attorney facing partnership problems, another opportunity to help someone fight back against impossible odds. "Winter's Legal Advocacy Center," I answered. "How can we help you protect what you've built?" As I listened to another story of betrayal and manipulation, I felt the familiar surge of energy that came with a new challenge. Victoria had called me a crazy old woman, expecting that label to diminish me. Instead, it had liberated me to become exactly who I was meant to be. Someone crazy enough to fight back, old enough to know how, and smart enough to win. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. Winters with criminal prosecution to coerce her into withdrawing legitimate legal complaints? Victoria's lead attorney whispered frantically in her ear, but she pushed him away. I was trying to make her understand the consequences of her actions, Victoria said, her voice shaking. By threatening false criminal charges? They wouldn't have been false. She illegally accessed my computer. To discover evidence that you were defrauding the partnership through secret negotiations and conflicts of interest? The trap was complete. Victoria had just admitted to the fraud while trying to defend her extortion threat. Judge Morrison's ruling was swift and comprehensive. She granted my motion for injunctive relief, blocking any acquisition pending resolution of the fraud allegations. She ordered a full forensic audit of the partnership's finances and client relationships. Most importantly, she referred the entire matter to both the U.S. Attorney's Office and the State Bar for investigation of potential criminal and ethical violations. Victoria walked out of that courtroom in handcuffs, not because she was under arrest, but because she'd violated the terms of a restraining order I'd obtained that morning, prohibiting her from accessing partnership files or communicating with clients about the acquisition. But my victory was just beginning. The federal investigation moved with surprising speed. Within 2 weeks, FBI agents had seized computers from both our office and Victoria's home. The forensic analysis revealed the full scope of her scheme. including deleted communications that showed she'd been planning to eliminate me as a partner long before the acquisition discussions began. More damaging was the discovery that Victoria had been skimming partnership funds for years, disguising personal expenses as business costs and inflating overhead charges to increase her own compensation. The total amount exceeded $200,000, enough to constitute felony embezzlement. Patricia's secret employment agreement with Blackstone Meyer led to additional charges for conspiracy and corporate espionage. James and Daniel, who had been unknowing participants in the scheme, cooperated fully with investigators in exchange for immunity. The state bar investigation was equally thorough. Victoria's law license was suspended pending resolution of the criminal charges. Patricia faced similar suspension plus potential disbarment for her conflicts of interest violations. But the most satisfying moment came when Blackstone Meyer's own legal problems reached the newspapers. The federal investigation had uncovered their pattern of acquiring firms through fraudulent means, stripping assets, and discarding founding partners. 3 of their senior partners were indicted on federal conspiracy charges. The firm that Victoria had been so eager to join was dissolving in scandal and criminal prosecution. 6 months after that first confrontation in the conference room, I sat in my new office in a building I'd purchased with the settlement money from Victoria's insurance company. The sign on the door read, Winters Legal Advocacy Center, and the mission was simple: helping small businesses and individual practitioners protect themselves from corporate predators and unethical partners. Professor Blackstone had joined me as senior counsel, bringing his decades of experience and his passion for legal ethics. We'd hired 3 young attorneys who shared our commitment to principled practice, and we'd developed a reputation for taking on cases that larger firms wouldn't touch. My first client was Maria Santos, a solo practitioner whose former partner had tried to steal her practice using tactics remarkably similar to Victoria's approach. The case was complex, and the fees were modest, but watching Maria's relief when we secured her firm's independence reminded me why I'd become a lawyer in the first place. The civil lawsuit against Victoria and Patricia was settled for $3 million, which I used to establish a legal aid fund for attorneys facing partnership disputes and ethical violations by colleagues. The fund provided resources for lawyers who couldn't afford to fight back against better-funded opponents. Victoria eventually pled guilty to wire fraud and conspiracy charges. She served 18 months in federal prison and was permanently disbarred. Her attempt to rebuild her career as a business consultant failed when her criminal record became public knowledge. Patricia's cooperation with investigators earned her a suspended sentence, but her legal career was finished. She eventually opened a small tax preparation business in Nevada, far from the high-stakes corporate law she'd once practiced. The story made national news when Legal Times published a comprehensive article about the case titled, "The Partner from Hell: How One Attorneys." Betrayal led to federal prosecution. The article became required reading in legal ethics courses across the country. But for me, the real victory wasn't the criminal convictions or the financial settlement. It was the morning I realized I'd stopped thinking about Victoria entirely. I was preparing for a client meeting when my assistant announced that a reporter from the Wall Street Journal wanted to interview me about partnership fraud in law firms. I started to decline, then realized I had something important to say. Attorney-client relationships are built on trust, I told the reporter. But too many lawyers forget that partnerships require the same foundation. When attorneys start viewing their partners as obstacles to overcome rather than colleagues to support, the entire profession suffers. The reporter asked if I regretted fighting back so aggressively against Victoria's scheme. Fighting back wasn't aggressive, I replied. It was necessary. Victoria made the mistake of assuming that age equals weakness and experience equals irrelevance. She confused courtesy with cowardice and professionalism with passivity. Do you have any advice for other attorneys facing similar situations? I thought about the question carefully. Document everything. Trust your instincts. And never let anyone convince you that standing up for yourself is unprofessional or unethical. Sometimes the most professional thing you can do is expose unprofessional conduct. The article ran 3 months later with the headline, "The 62-year-old Attorney Who Brought Down a Corporate Law Conspiracy." It generated dozens of calls from lawyers facing similar situations, and we were able to help several of them protect their practices from unethical partners. One call was particularly memorable. A young female attorney in Chicago was facing pressure from male partners who were trying to force her out after she'd discovered financial irregularities in their client accounts. "I read about your case," she said. "I'm afraid to fight back because they have more resources and better connections. What if I can't prove what they're doing?" "The question isn't whether you can prove it," I told her. "The question is whether you can live with yourself if you don't try. Your evidence doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be real."